The sewers of New York had a pulse. Down below the frantic rush of cabs and the kaleidoscope of neon lights, the tunnels hummed with their own kind of life. Rats skittered, water dripped, and the distant roar of subway trains rattled the pipes. But tonight, there was something else, something ancient and foul. It moved like a whisper, curling through the damp air like cigarette smoke. Jim Delaney adjusted his flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the murk. He wasn't supposed to be down here, not really. The city had contractors for this sort of thing, but when your kid sister called in hysterics, you didn't ask questions. Especially not when she said, "Jim, they took Kenny. They took him into the sewers." Kenny was 9, sweet kid, didn't deserve whatever they were. The flashlight flickered, and Jim cursed under his breath. He'd grabbed it on his way out the door, along with an old baseball bat from his Little League days. Now he wished he'd brought something more lethal. The air smelled wrong, thick and heavy, like rotten eggs mixed with old pennies. Sulphur and blood. Ahead, the tunnel yawned into a cavernous junction, its walls slick with algae. Strange symbols, some kind of graffiti, were scrawled in red paint. Or maybe it wasn't paint at all. Jim felt a shiver climb his spine. He'd seen enough true crime documentaries to know bad shit happened in places like this. "Kenny!" he called, his voice bouncing off the curved walls. Only the sound of water answered. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. Something was watching him. A mile away, deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels, 20 people knelt in a circle. Their faces were obscured by crude masks fashioned from rat skulls and leather, their robes soaked to the knee in sewage. At the centre of the circle, a boy with wide, terrified eyes struggled against the ropes binding his wrists and ankles. Kenny's muffled cries were swallowed by the chanting. The leader stood, raising a jagged blade high above his head. His voice echoed deep and guttural like the sound of rocks grinding together. "Alzaroth, hear us! We call you forth from the abyss. Take this offering and grant us your power." The circle surged with energy. The symbols on the walls began to glow, oozing crimson light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air grew colder, and the shadows that shouldn't have been there, began to writhe and stretch. In the corner, something impossibly large began to emerge. First came the claws, long and black, glinting like polished obsidian. Then the horns, curling and jagged. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, twin orbs of molten gold that seemed to see everything. The cultists gasped, some weeping with ecstasy, others trembling in fear. The demon's voice was a deep rumble that vibrated the very air. "Who dares summon me?" Jim heard the sound before he saw the light. A low, bone-rattling growl echoed through the tunnels, followed by a flash of crimson that turned the dark into a surreal nightmare. He stumbled, nearly dropping the flashlight. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in time with his racing heart. "Kenny!" he shouted again, but this time his voice cracked. Fear, hot and bitter, rose in his throat. The sound of wet footsteps, many of them, came from the darkness ahead. Jim tightened his grip on the bat, his palms slick with sweat. When the first figure appeared, his breath caught. It was a man, or at least it had been. His eyes were glassy, his face pale, and his hands twitched as though he were a puppet on tangled strings. Behind him came more, men and women, all wearing those grotesque masks, their bodies moving in jerky, unnatural motions. "Stay back!" Jim yelled, swinging the bat in a wide arc. The nearest figure stopped, tilting its head as though confused. Then it lunged. The bat connected with a sickening crack, and the figure crumpled, but the others didn't even flinch. They moved closer, their footsteps splashing in the filthy water. Jim turned and ran. Behind him, The demon's roar shook the tunnels. It was awake now, fully here, and it was hungry. Jim found himself in a larger chamber. The ceiling arched like the nave of a cathedral. At its centre, a massive pit yawned, its edges lined with more of those glowing symbols. The air around it shimmered like heat waves, and the smell of sulphur was overwhelming. Kenny lay on the ground near the edge, his small body still but mercifully breathing. "Kenny!" Jim rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the boy. He fumbled with the ropes, his hands shaking. "It's too late," a voice said. Jim looked up to see the cult leader standing across the pit, his mask discarded, to reveal a gaunt, weathered face. His eyes gleamed with a fanatical light. "You can't stop it. Alzaroth has risen. He will cleanse this city of its filth." "Cleanse this, asshole," Jim snarled, hefting the bat. The demon's laughter rumbled through the chamber, a sound that made Jim's teeth ache. "You think your world can contain me?" it bellowed. Its form was fully visible now, a grotesque blend of sinew and shadow, its wings stretching impossibly wide. Jim didn't think. He grabbed Kenny and ran, the cult leader's screams echoing behind him, as the demon took its first steps into the world above. They emerged into the night, gasping for air, just as the ground beneath New York began to tremble. Above them, the city's lights flickered, and the sky turned an unnatural shade of red. Sirens wailed in the distance. Jim held Kenny close, his mind racing. He didn't know what the hell was coming next, but he knew one thing: the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.